Okay, two for one today. We're gonna be traveling, and um, we have to leave at. I mean, our plane leaves at 7:05 a.m. So I'm not really. I won't get up at 3:05 to be able to do this, and then be able to get to the airport. And so okay. Anyway, uh, we were talking about providing for your relatives and especially for your own household. Who are we talking about? Well, that's not that hard. I mean, who's your relative? You've got a series of concentric circles. I'm, I don't know them, but I'm sure I have third cousins somewhere. But they're way, I mean, they're like there's hardly any difference between the circle they're in and the circle of the whole rest of this town I live in. So, but the closer the circle is in, the more opportunity and I'll even say responsibility I have to help take care of the people in those closer circles. Um, Paul's talking in specific. We talked. I keep hitting on this, but can't lose track of it. Paul's talking specifically about widows. Now, this probably puts them in the extended circle to some degree, right? Can't be married to them. You're dead. You could be a daughter or a son. They could be your grandmother. And although it would rarely have happened in Paul's culture and Timothy's, that the widower was at risk in the same way that the widow was. So I'm going to rule that out. These are women and they're members of our family. I think the farthest out I would think of that would be an aunt who was a widow. To take care, he says, provide for their relatives. Now, you can provide on lots of different levels. And again, now let's set it in its historical context as best we can. What were the primary needs of people in century one? Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but the foundational needs are health and safety needs. Like we've got to have food, water, oxygen is in there, but thankfully we don't very often have to make provision for that. Clothing, shelter, physical safety. Okay, I think that's what Paul's talking about, and the Holy Spirit through Paul. Provide for these basic needs for your relatives. In our culture, it could be that a relative in this closer circle for me would need clothing, food, shelter, perhaps physical protection. There are lots of different ways to provide for them in those needs. It still comes down to I've got to be aware of what they need and willing to do what I can to provide for them. Duh, I mean, that's not rocket science. Is it happening in our world? To a degree, it is. And it so much depends on culture. You think about this. People from Latino cultures are much more likely to take care of their families, extended families, than the average American is. And this is not true in all Latino countries, but generally it's true of the culture that their families are closely knit, and they maintain the responsibility to care for each other. You routinely hear stories of illegal aliens who are, they work like dogs for less than the rest of the world works for, or at least in America, and they send everything except the little bit they've got to have to live here back home to support their families. Okay. It just doesn't have to, we don't have the same needs as, normal average Americans. Why? Several reasons. Number one, without getting political, I think you have to admit our economy is it's not great. There is a high unemployment, and the uptake has been way less than half expected most recently. But even in that, there are families that are going without basic needs. There are. I'm seriously thinking they're probably not in our neighborhoods. Okay. But it is one of the reasons these kinds of needs are not as obvious, and that we're not on the lookout for them so much, is because we don't have to. We have systems in place, generally government systems, that provide assistance to people in the best cases and in its best form to people who have legitimate needs. Why was that important? Why did we get here? Lots of different theories on that. One of the theories I think is substantial is because the family became less the hub. And as one of the results of that is that the family then didn't provide for its extended self, if that makes any sense. Gosh, I'm not going to get in this philosophical, sociological debate, but the fact remains, if you like history at all, even if you don't like history, it do you well to go back and look at what happened when the Industrial Revolution began, and as it moved into full swing, is that families moved from the country to the city. Now, while families were in the country, they were much more interdependent. It was difficult to farm or even ranch and be totally independent of your neighbors. And it was the practice in these it still is in the agricultural areas of the United States anyway, that neighbors help neighbors. I lived briefly for 3.5 years in Northeast Iowa, which is very nearly completely ag. Story after story of a farmer who had a heart attack or a serious illness, or for whatever reason at harvest time he couldn't bring in his crops. His neighbors, people would drive for hundreds of miles to get there to help. Okay, that mentality still exists there, but it began to diminish as people moved from the farm to the city, where the industry was. They then, although you had to be in a cooperative relationship, it was a whole different kind of cooperation. And sometimes people from certain specific areas of the country and the world gathered into a community. And in that sense, in that setting, they were much more bonded than most of the country is today. Okay, I already slid off the cliff into the historicity of the industrial movement and revolution. Suffice it to say, I don't When my mom and dad were alive, I lived 1,100 miles away. For, they were alive for most of the 13 years that I was out there. For probably the last 8 years or so that we were in Tulsa, they lived in Tulsa. And I'm telling you, I was in a position to know their needs in a way that was much, much better than when I was 1,000 miles away. So the proximity issue, lots of us don't have the benefit of being geographically close to our families. And so we have to take measures that people in Paul's day never had to take. Most people never went more than 30, 40, 60 miles at the most away from home. So caring for your relatives, providing for your relatives, probably didn't mean take a 600-mile journey to find out what they need and then do what you can to provide. It was much more geographically localized. We don't live in that world. Are we no longer responsible to provide for our relatives? I think we still are. I think it's more complicated today than it was in Paul's day, but certainly no less important today than it was then, to the degree that Paul, listen to this, anyone who does not, this is 1 Timothy 5:8, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Yikes. Is this a theological absolute? Some people would say yes. Not so sure. But I am going to say there's a principle here. You take care of your family. And there's a strong implication because of the Greek, the language in which Paul wrote, that this was addressed to the male members and also applied to the female members of God's family, his household. Oh, speaking of household, he uses that word here, and especially their own household. That's the tightest or next tightest circle. I've got these concentric circles like a target. I believe the bullseye of the target would be, if I'm married, it's my wife, and if we have children, my wife and my children. The next ring out would be my siblings and my parents. And if I'm not married, then that would be probably the bullseye of my target, my siblings and my parents. And as you go out, now in a Greek or Greco-Roman household, a household there in Ephesus, the Greek word, I love this spouting what little Greek I have learned. I haven't learned any Greek. I can just repeat words that I have heard. The word here is oikos. And the only reason I can remember that is because it sounds like oinkus. Well, oikos was household. And in an Ephesian household, this would have been the parents, children, probably for many households, parents. Also, it would have been live-in servants, probably, if you had any affluence at all, slaves. Your household. These are the people, really. The word in its most basic form means under my roof. And if we don't take care of those people, Paul says we've denied the faith and we're worse than an unbeliever. Holy cow. How I treat my family? is a strong expression of my devotion to God. What about difficult family members? We're going to talk about that next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.